That's a plant that's going to make a big difference when it comes to the majority of your meals going forward if you like to use peppers, hot or sweet, as seasoning. So we're definitely adding peppers to this list. Guten gardening, everybody. You know, it is a balmy 33 degrees outside here in Zone 5, Wisconsin, and that may not seem warm to some people, but if you've lived through the weather we've lived through the last couple of weeks, even that 30-mile-an-hour gust of wind that I kept feeling out there couldn't compare to that cold. Now, I was outside for a very specific reason. I wanted to walk the property or walk the garden, because really that's what it is now. And, you know, I think we grow a lot of food for the space that we have. We've transformed so much of our yard into garden space, but still I can walk the entirety of it in less than a minute. And that's taking my time, because the reality is for a lot of us, we don't have a large amount of space to dedicate to our gardens, but we still want to get the best bang for our buck. We still want to grow as much food as possible. So that's the focus of today's video. I'm going to focus in on a few vegetables. These are vegetables we're going to recommend you grow if you want to get really good production, or at least have the potential for really good production, even if you don't have a massive amount of space. Now, one of the things I love about a list like this is that it's not all inclusive. It is a list built on my own experiences. It's a list built on some of my own research. And so there are plenty of other options out there I'm sure you might recommend. And if you have other things that you think should be grown, especially to get that good production in a limited space, we'd love for you to leave that in the comments. Now, this list is in no particular order other than if the vegetable made this list, we think you should grow it. And we're going to start with tomatoes. Now, one of the things that I love about vegetables is that there's such a variety easily available to most people. And tomatoes are a great example of that, because there are so many different varieties of determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. Indeterminate growing massive, determinate getting to a specific size. And if you're somebody who has a smaller gardening space, you have the ability to buy determinate or dwarf or micro dwarf tomatoes, where you can get good production in a smaller plant. I mean, those dwarf tomatoes, one of my favorites, the Tiny Tim dwarf tomatoes, you get about 14, maybe 16 inches for the entirety of the plant, and they're loaded down with cherry tomatoes. Now, tomatoes can produce anywhere upwards of, I'd say, 20 pounds of fruit if you take care of your tomato plant. You may even have had better success than that, but that is a really great producer, and one where you're going to be able to use the tomatoes fresh. That's my garden candy right there, in sauces, in juices, diced up in meals. There's just so much diversity in the way in which tomatoes can be prepared, and they're such great producers. We're going to start off with those tomatoes. And by the way, tomatoes tend to be pretty easy to grow. In fact, if you've planted a tomato once, you've probably found that that tomato plant has volunteered to come back because of the seeds of the fruit that have fallen to the ground. So they're a pretty easy plant to grow. They're a phenomenal producer, and you can definitely grow them in smaller spaces depending on the variety that you choose. You know, in addition to the benefit of variety for these vegetables, so many of them can be grown in smaller containers. And I think that's really beneficial to us. We have a container garden here at Guten Gardening, our patio container garden. We grow in containers, raised beds, in ground, you know, whatever it takes to take advantage of space. And these vegetables are going to fit the bill for basically any growing environment that is a quality growing environment. So let's move on to our second vegetable, and that is summer squash. You know, most of the summer squash that we grow here is bush variety summer squash. Things like Black Beauty zucchini, for example. We've grown patipan squash, the early straight neck, the early prolific straight neck. And actually, the early prolific straight neck is called prolific for a reason. The plants are massive producers. When it comes to productivity, there's so many things to love about summer squash. It's quite easy, and I can definitely say we've experienced this. It's quite easy to get 10 to 15 pounds or more from summer squash, regardless of the variety. One of the things to know about summer squash is that if you harvest frequently, once they get to the size where you'd like to eat them, once you harvest frequently, it encourages the plant to keep growing more and more fruit. And that's one of the things I absolutely love about these plants. You know, the other side of that is that even if you don't harvest frequently, even if you let the fruit of the plant, the zucchini itself or the summer squash, get overly ripe and grow too big, There's some people that really love those oversized zucchini, but you could come out of there with a 5, 6, 7 pound fruit off of one of those zucchini or summer squash plants, create zoodles with it, and still enjoy it. So we're talking about pretty big production in a space that's a couple of feet wide, depending on the variety. And just like tomatoes, and actually along with tomatoes, it is pretty versatile when it comes to different preparations. And I said along with tomatoes because I actually like to roast summer squash along with some tomatoes and other vegetables. So if you're looking for something in a soup, if you're looking for a puree of some kind, if you're looking for a roasted vegetable, there's a ton of options with summer squash. And yes, again, it's going to be a big producer for you. Now, next up on our list, we've got beans, and I'm going to focus specifically on pole beans, even though we've grown a lot of bush beans, and bush beans don't take up all that much space, 10, 12 inches or so, depending on the variety. And you can get good production off those bush beans. I typically prefer the taste of bush beans, but when it comes to longevity of the plant and overall production, I'm not sure you can beat those pole beans. And pole beans don't actually take up all that much space horizontally, because with a little bit of trellising, you can get them to go up and down the other side of a trellis and get massive amounts of production in a minimal amount of space. Recently, we've been growing Blue Lake and Kentucky Wonder varieties. I've enjoyed both of those very much, and you could be looking at a couple of pounds of production per plant. And since you can plant those bean plants pretty close together, you could get quite a bit of really good nutritional content as well out of these beans. Now, I don't know about you, but I love a good raw green bean right out of the garden. But each of these vegetables that I'm talking about is producing massive amounts, and each of these vegetables seems to be really versatile. I think sometimes when it comes to vegetables, maybe it's based on our childhood, I'm not sure, but I think we limit the way sometimes that we fix or prepare these vegetables when there's really no need. There's so many different ways to consume each of these, and beans are no different. I like beans in my soup, in my vegetable soup. I don't know about you. I also like beans all by themselves. There's so many ways to eat them, and that's another vegetable we've got to add to our list. Now, one of the things you're going to notice about the different vegetables on this list, some of them are really filling on their own. Others can use a little bit of preparation with the other vegetables on this list. And I would argue that the next one is a bit like that. That would be peppers. Now, the most amazing thing to me about peppers is that when I first started gardening, I had no idea that pepper plants could live for more than 1 year. I had no idea about that. That's one of the things that you learn as part of the process of learning in gardening. And so pepper plants not only can live for quite a long time, but that really, if you think about it, that increases the amount of productivity that you can get from a singular pepper plant. And depending on the type of pepper that you're growing, you could see several pounds of production out of individual pepper plants. Now, we've grown a lot of California Wonder bell peppers, which, as you probably have heard, if you've grown peppers for any length of time, it's a really common bell pepper, but they've been very productive for us. And the other side of that is, with peppers, a little bit can go a long way too, especially with your hotter peppers. So we grew 3 jalapeno plants this year. I believe it was 3 jalapeno. It might have been 4. My memory's not what it used to be. But we grew just a couple, and we have been now for the last several months using some of those that I chopped up and froze, just here and there in different recipes, and really getting the nice taste from those jalapenos. So most of our pepper plants are really nice producers. And on top of that, since you don't necessarily have to use so much at one time, and they store well really easily frozen, for example, there's a lot of other ways that you can store them, but they store really well and really easily frozen, then that's a plant that's going to make a big difference when it comes to the majority of your meals going forward, if you like to use peppers, hot or sweet, as seasoning. So we're definitely adding peppers to this list. Now, you're probably wondering, how on earth have I gotten this far without mentioning one of our favorite vegetables, favorite plants to grow in general in the garden, sweet potatoes? Well, probably a part of you understands that a majority of sweet potato plants are vining sweet potatoes, which means they take up a good amount of space. But even though a lot of the varieties can take up a good amount of space, the plants themselves, as they're growing, can also overlap each other. You can throw them back on top of each other to minimize some of the space that they're taking up. So that's one thing. But also, there are bush varieties of sweet potatoes, and bush varieties only typically spread about 3 or 4 feet wide for the entirety of the plant, and you still get some good production, a couple of pounds, hopefully, out of each of those sweet potato slips. So in actuality, while a lot of these sweet potatoes can be bigger, you can actually take advantage and grow sweet potatoes in smaller spaces as well. And on top of that, and we don't eat too many of them because of the need for the plant to use photosynthesis to grow and produce good sweet potato roots, we also can eat the leaves from the sweet potato plant. So you get the sweet potatoes themselves, which are incredibly nutritious, very filling, and good producing, and you can have the leaves as a secondary harvest. And anytime you can add a secondary harvest to a smaller garden space, that's a good idea to us. Now, the vegetable that's been behind me the whole time has to make this list, and that is kale. And kale is one of those really nutritious vegetables that can grow for an extended period of time, even in cold weather areas. And I'll tell you something interesting. As I was just out looking at our garden, the kale itself isn't going to do anything. Some of it's going to come back and we'll be able to collect seeds from it in the second year, because that's how kale works. That's when it goes to seed. So I've left some plants out there that were good producers during the season. It'll come back to life in a way, and we'll be able to get the seeds from it this season. But there was actually still some green visible on those plants, even though we've had weather that has been ridiculously cold here. Now, that all being said, there are times where we've had kale growing up through Christmas or later here in Zone 5, Wisconsin, that we've been able to get outside and harvest. So imagine, as the kale plant grows, and it's a good cut and come again vegetable, you're pulling off the outer leaves, the inside keeps growing, and you're not taking up a massive amount of space. I would say in most cases, a lot of the varieties that we grow, you can limit in to about 15, 16 inches or so wide. And it's just going to keep growing vertically as you're pulling off those lower leaves. And over time, and truly over a long period of time, you could be harvesting 5 to 10 pounds of leaves. I would have to estimate there, but the quantity is very high, of a vegetable that, again, is going to be really versatile. I know some people love kale chips. They're just okay in my mind. We eat kale smoothies. We put our kale in soup. I've even dehydrated kale, ground it into powder. I'd say the most common use for us for kale is definitely in the smoothies, but it's really nutritious, really versatile, and incredibly productive, even in the colder grow zones. So it's definitely a vegetable that had to make our list. All right, next up on the list, we've got Swiss chard. Now, my understanding is some folks find Swiss chard to be a little bit on the bitter side when it comes to greens. It's a very healthy vegetable. It's another cut and come again vegetable. In fact, as I look down beside me in my smaller buckets here, you can see some of our Swiss chard that we have growing here. I've got a couple of plants in each one of these smaller buckets. It just so happens to be one of my favorite leafy greens out there. I love the flavor. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you love the flavor or like the flavor or dislike the flavor of Swiss chard? Well, one thing I know as a cut and come again vegetable, once it gets started, just like kale, although not as hardy as kale, just like kale, you can come back time after time after time to Swiss chard and really pull that in fresh as a salad. I prefer it steamed. I love the smell. I'll throw some onions in with the Swiss chard, steam it up nicely. I think it tastes absolutely amazing. It's going to be a big producer. And just like a lot of the other plants, you're looking at about a foot of space, maybe a little bit wider, depending on the variety, with a ton of great production. So again, Swiss chard, you've got to be on our list. Oh, and Swiss chard is one of those vegetables that is going to be really easy to grow in containers. In fact, that's where we grow most of our Swiss chard, is actually in containers, although sometimes we'll still plant it in ground. All right, I had to make a decision as to whether or not I was going to add potatoes to this list. And this is a really hard thing for me to say that I was even questioning it, simply because if you've watched our channel, you know I love growing potatoes. I love the taste of potato. I love the experience of harvesting potatoes. Potatoes are interesting. They do have some really good nutritional value. It's a little bit hard for some folks to be able to eat a lot of potatoes, especially if you're ones that are on the higher end for the glycemic index. But given the fact that we have grown so many potatoes in smaller spaces, in containers, in grow bags, in pots, etc., I had to include it on this list. You know, most of the time we try to get between 8 to 10 times a return on planting investment when it comes to our potatoes, meaning for every pound of potato seed or seed potato we plant, we try to get 8 to 10 times that amount on return. Now, that may be low to some of you, that may be high to some of you, but that's just a goal where I'm at right now anyway. I think that's a really good return on investment. And the fact that this is a great example, like a lot of these other vegetables, of you planted it once, then you have the ability to take some of what you've harvested and turn that into a future planting. I think it's really worthwhile to grow even in a smaller garden space. And I'll also say that the experience, just like with sweet potatoes, the experience of growing this and harvesting it is something I think everyone should have some time where they do this. I think everyone should have that experience. It is so enjoyable. And in terms of plant size, potatoes don't actually take up all that much space. I mean, given the fact that we've been able to grow these in 3, 4, and 5 gallon buckets, I would say that you can get an estimation as to how much space you need for a plant like potatoes. All right, the 9th vegetable on our list is eggplant. Now, not everybody loves eggplant. And honestly, I think the reason why a lot of people don't love eggplant is poor preparation, like the experience with poor preparation, because it can get a little mushy, a little soggy, depending on how you cook it. But when it's prepared well, I think the flavor can be exceptional. And you talk about a plant that doesn't take up a ton of space, but can be a massive producer. Eggplants can produce so much. You frequently harvest. You don't let them get too big. Don't let the skin get too tough on them. But if you harvest frequently, I think possibly eggplant has been one of the most prolific producers for us in the past few years. And again, there's so many different varieties of eggplant available. I highly recommend you give it a try. Even if you've never really found that you love the taste of eggplant, one of the things I'll suggest is grow it for yourself, just like any of these other vegetables. Homegrown is going to taste different. Grow it for yourselves. Look for a good 5-star or as close to 5-star recipe as possible that you can find online, and try preparing it yourself. If you still don't love it, don't grow it again. But I'm going to tell you something. You grow it in some good soil, you're going to have eggplant coming out your ears. All right, I'm ready for the last vegetable. I hope you are as well. I'm sure you're probably sitting there saying that there's something that I've forgotten, something I should have put on this list. I hope so, because I'd love for you again to add that down in the comments. The more you comment, the more you like these videos, the more the algorithm says, hey, we're going to share this content with other people. So yes, would love to hear what I missed out on this list. But here we go. I'm going to say that you should, even if you have a small space, you should try growing winter squash. There are actually some more compact varieties of winter squash out there, something like a delicata, for example. And even though most winter squash spreads out, and if you think about it, you could have 10, 12 feet of width for some of these vining type varieties of winter squash, even though that's potentially true, you can actually trellis your winter squash and minimize the footprint and still get some absolutely amazing production. And winter squash is not only really healthy for you, not only a big producer, not only is it actually something that is really versatile, different flavors of sweetness for whatever you like, but also it is a great plant, a great vegetable for storing. We've had some of our butternut squash, as an example, store well over a year and still taste amazing. And so winter squash, again, depending on how you grow it, can actually be a good fit in a smaller garden space. You just have to be a little creative. But I promise, once you harvest the winter squash and you see how well it stores, I think you're going to be a big fan. All right, what did I miss out on? What did I leave off this list? Where do you disagree with me? Or maybe you agree with everything on this list. Maybe you've grown it all. I don't know. But hey, I hope this video was informative, useful, got some ideas flowing for the upcoming gardening season. If there are some of these vegetables you've never tried growing before, go ahead and give it a try. I think it's worthwhile. But in my mind, the most important thing here is that you're growing your own food, you're giving it a try, and you're trying your best to maximize as much of your growing space as possible, regardless of how much room you have. Hey folks, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, when you're with us, you are good to grow.